Thank you so much. And the last speaker on the panel is Dr. Noelle Hurd. She's an assistant professor of psychology here at the University of Virginia. And her research focuses on factors that promote more positive psychosocial outcomes among marginalized adolescents, with a particular focus on pre-existing strengths in youth's lives, such as the presence of supportive relationships with non-parental adults. And her talk is titled Examining Natural Mentoring Relationships Among Black Adolescents. And I just lost it, a strengths-based perspective to promoting psychosocial well-being.
Hello. So as Nancy mentioned, my name is Noelle, and I am in the Department of Psychology, but I'm also affiliated with the Curry School and with Youth-Nex and with the Carter G. Woodson Institute. So I'm going to try and briefly introduce you to my program of research, talk about some recent findings, just to give you a little bit of an overview of what you can expect. So I'll start by telling you what natural mentoring relationships are. I'll talk a little bit more about this focus on Black adolescents, review some findings from recent studies, talk a little bit about some of the next steps that we're doing in terms of my program of research and my research team. And then, because I know there are like practitioners in the audience, and a lot of you are here as a part of maybe affiliation with a program, I want to talk a little bit about some possible implications for practice from this work. All right, so natural mentoring relationships, some of you are probably familiar, or maybe all of you are familiar with this idea of mentoring, the idea that a young person could go to an older and more experienced person for support, advice, help making important decisions. And the differentiation really between natural or informal mentoring and formal mentoring is that these are relationships that develop organically or on their own outside of a formal program. So these are adults from youth's everyday lives. These can be extended family members. They are non-parental adults, but they can be extended family members. They can be adults from the neighborhood, adults from a young person's religious community, adults from the school. In terms of thinking about, I think this is very consistent. One of the reasons Joanna probably asked me to be a part of this panel is I like to think about natural mentoring relationships within the Black community to take a strengths-based approach, right? So I think there is this narrative, especially in the social sciences historically, we've talked a lot about youth of color from a very deficit-based perspective. And when we only talk about mentoring in the context of formal programs, I think we can neglect the fact that there are really positive adults within the Black community that are providing mentoring relationships to young people, and that we should be focusing a little bit more on these relationships as a pre-existing strength, and also as a low-cost resource that we could think about mobilizing for youth who don't have these relationships. It doesn't require pouring a lot of resources from the outside or bringing other people into the community. It's more about mobilizing resources that already exist. All right, so just a brief review of some research findings. I kind of started this work maybe about 10 years ago. This was in Michigan at the time when I was doing this research, and was finding that Black youth who had natural mentoring relationships starting in their freshman year of high school seem to be having very different trajectories through their first few years of adulthood in comparison to their peers who didn't. So we were seeing trajectories that displayed lower mental health problems, lower health risk behaviors. These findings were above and beyond the support that young people were receiving from peers and parents. So it wasn't just about young people who had more support collectively. It seems like there's a unique contribution of having this supportive relationship with an adult other than a parent. And then one of the really interesting findings was in terms of one of the ways in which these relationships might be useful to young people. And it seems that, a lot of us have talked about stressful experiences. These might be like experiences with discrimination. The youth in this particular study were from a very economically disadvantaged community. So there's a lot of stressors related to poverty. And we are finding that among youth, these stressful experiences, which are predictive of mental health problems, it seemed that having these natural mentoring relationships was reducing that association. So the harmful effects of stress were less potent when these relationships were in place. All right, so one of the, two of the questions, I guess, that we've been looking at a little bit more recently are, one is kind of what are the pathways? So for youth who have these relationships, how is it that benefits are conferred to young people through these relationships? And then another question we've tried to look at a little bit more in depth is what is it about the relationships that may determine how effective they are? I'm just going to briefly review a couple of findings here. So this study, again, with Black youth, and at the start of the study, they were in high school, and we were looking to see whether or not they had these mentoring relationships. And then these three here, public regard, private regard, and centrality, are dimensions of racial identity. I'll briefly define them for you. So public regard really refers, we're asking Black youth how they feel, kind of broader society feels about Black people. How do you feel like, the broader, other groups other than Black people view your own racial group? The second dimension, private regard, is more consistent with like racial pride. So it's like, how do you feel as a Black adolescent? How do you feel about being Black and about Black people and their contributions to society? And then the third dimension here, centrality, really just means how central is being Black to your identity. So first finding was that youth who had these natural mentoring relationships, all three of these dimensions were elevated for these youth in comparison to youth who didn't. So this seems to suggest that there may be something about, I think Noni earlier talked about racial socialization that might be happening among parents to Black children. This seems to suggest that these natural mentoring relationships also may play a role in helping youth to kind of develop their racial identity, which, as Joanna mentioned earlier, is a really important task, developmental task for youth of color. And then interestingly, it was only racial pride that was predictive of youth's beliefs in the importance of school for future success. So if I have higher racial pride, I'm going to be more likely to endorse beliefs that school is going to help me to get ahead in life. And that may be for multiple reasons. Maybe I'm more aware of kind of the struggles historically or currently that Blacks are facing and seeing education as a real opportunity to kind of open doors. I may also be feeling more connected to my racial group, so I might feel like it's not just my own personal advancement, but it's also advancing a broader group that I feel a strong membership with. And then these beliefs in the importance of school for future success were actually predictive of later educational attainment in a positive way. So following youth 5 years post-high school and seeing that we were finding greater educational attainment. So this is, one example of some of the things that we're doing in terms of just trying to better unpack, if natural mentoring relationships are important, how are they important, why, kind of what are the mechanisms here that are driving those findings. And then, as I mentioned before, some of the work that we're doing to try and just better understand the characteristics of or different aspects of these relationships. So you see here at the bottom, these are some of the characteristics of relationships that we've looked at. Things such as how long has the relationship been in place, how involved is the adult with the youth, how close does the youth report feeling to the adult, and then how frequently are they in contact with each other. So in this study, again, this study was with middle school, Black students in middle school. And we saw that what I labeled here, the MC for more connected and the LC for less connected, we found that there was a smaller group of youth with these natural mentoring relationships that were just relatively lower across all of these dimensions, okay? So 0 here is actually the mean. It's a little misleading. It's not that they were like negative on these things, but relative to the more connected group, they were lower. And so then we wanted to kind of do some comparisons to see how these might predict outcomes having a more connected or a less connected mentoring relationship. And consistent with kind of the theme of the conference and Youth-Nex in terms of positive youth development, we were looking to see how having these mentoring relationships versus not having a mentoring relationship might predict some of these important positive youth development outcomes like social skills and psychological well-being. So interestingly, we found that having a lower connected mentoring relationship youth who had those relationships didn't look any different on these social skills or psych well-being compared to youth who didn't have mentoring relationships at all. So it really was youth who had the more connected, who were reporting more involvement, feeling closer, greater frequency of contact. Those were the youth who really did look different from the youth without mentoring relationships in terms of having higher social skills and higher psych well-being, and kind of consistent with the positive youth development literature. We found that those, quote unquote, soft skills or psychological components were really important for then predicting how engaged they were in the classroom, both using student self-report, but also using teachers' reports as well. All right, so then just moving forward into like some directions for future research. A lot of that research, as you can see, that's just a few of the studies that I wanted to highlight in terms of thinking about promoting strengths among Black youth through natural mentoring. One of the questions that we're starting to ask now as a lab is, what about the youth who don't have these relationships? So we've focused really heavily on youth with the relationships. What is it about the relationships that makes them effective? How do they work? But we found, anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on the study, of Black youth who are reporting that they don't have these relationships, all right? And so one of the reasons I first started thinking about these relationships within the Black community is that we know from kind of a historical perspective that there's values of kind of communalism or collectivism that may make these relationships more likely to happen. We know that the extended family tends to play a more central role in the family system. And we also know that there's oftentimes fictive kin or adults who are not related by blood or legal ties, but who are playing a family-like role for the young person. So we have reason to think that these relationships would potentially be more prevalent, and yet we still have variability. We still have youth who don't have the relationships. So now as a group, we're trying to better understand what might be some of the contextual factors that would predict whether or not youth would have these relationships. So we're right now looking at a study where we're going to try and better understand family as a context for whether or not these relationships develop. And we're looking at some basic things like just opportunity, right? Just exposure. So do I come from a larger family? Do I have family that live close by, within close proximity? What is my primary caregiver's relationship with other adults in the family? We're also kind of interested in how youth are spending their time out of school, kind of how structured that time is or how many responsibilities they have. So again, just trying to better understand what's that family context like and how might that promote these relationships or maybe in some ways deter them, and thinking about that as a possible place for intervening. And then we're also interested in like broader community spaces, right? So we know from some previous research that when a community has higher levels of violence or there's kind of less infrastructure or police are less present or if they're present, they're not present in a positive way, that this can make adults not want their children to be out in the community, right? And it can also promote mistrust. So if I'm an adult and I'm not feeling very safe in my community, I might not want my child to get involved with other adults in the community. I may be more mistrustful. So we're looking at some of these other factors now to just try and better understand not just kind of like personal motivation for these relationships on the youth or the adults' part, but what are the broader contexts within which these relationships might develop. All right, so some conclusions just from this body of work to date. One is that these natural mentoring relationships are a low cost and kind of widely available resource for Black youth, and that we might want to think more about how can we mobilize them as an intervention strategy, right? So as opposed to like bringing a lot of outside adults into the community, how can we think about motivating adults and youth within the community to engage in these relationships. And as I just mentioned with my last slide, I do think that any efforts to mobilize these relationships are going to be contingent on not just kind of socializing or motivating adults and youth to engage in them, but also we're really going to need to have contexts that are conducive to their formation. So we really need both and. All right, so a couple just closing thoughts in terms of, I don't know how many of you are here with like kind of a formal mentoring type of program, but even if you're not a formal mentoring program, but mentoring is a component of the work that you do, or you're just doing an intervention or some kind of youth program, but adults are involved, I think these are things for all of us to think about. So I want to talk just briefly about what some of the problems are, I think, when programs ignore natural mentoring, and also close with just some ideas about what programs, formal mentoring or other types of youth-oriented programs could do. All right, so one thing we may do with these programs when we don't pay any attention to, I mean, maybe we pay a little bit of attention to parents, but we may not pay any attention to other adults in youth lives. We may very unintentionally, I don't mean to suggest this with malice, but unintentionally we may be communicating the idea that we don't think there are other positive adults present in youth's everyday lives. So just by focusing exclusively on adults in a program, for example, we might be inadvertently communicating to youth that there aren't other positive adults in their life that we think are important, that we want to help them to develop relationships with. And research on formal mentoring and kind of thinking about adults that work with youth through these types of formal programs suggests that one of the key mechanisms through in which these relationships are beneficial to young people is by helping them to have more positive relationships with other adults in their lives. So given that this is already something that we're seeing from the research, by not paying attention to it, we're neglecting one of the key potential mechanisms through in which these kind of formal programs may be helpful to young people of color. And then a lot of times, whether it's a program, whether it's a mentoring relationship, these oftentimes are time limited, right? And if you're thinking about it from a programmatic perspective, you're trying to provide as much resources to as many youth as possible. And so sometimes this just requires having a time limited kind of involvement, or it's only developmentally appropriate for a limited period of time. And so what we don't want to see is that youth get a lot of benefits from a program or from a relationship, but then those just go out the window as soon as that program ends or as soon as that relationship ends. So we really want to think about kind of enduring benefits. We don't want the benefits to be circumscribed just to the duration of the relationship or the program. So thinking about, how having these other relationships could be a key way to have sustaining benefit for the young people who we're involved with, especially if we're involved with them in a time-limited type of way. All right, so in closing, just a few suggestions of things that programs may want to think about doing a little bit more. One, obviously, I think is just making this more of an explicit goal. And I know Nancy's done this in some of her work. We're starting to do this a little bit more, but there's this activity like social network mapping, which doesn't even take that much time, and it's something that program-affiliated adults could do with young people. It's just a matter of saying, let's figure out who all the adults are in your social network, and who do you go to for this, and who do you go to for that? Who helps you when you have a hard time? Who gives you advice when you're not sure what to do, right? And it's a way of just, for that adult who's working with the young person, to even get a sense of who those adults are and start to have that conversation. Similarly, we could be training mentors or adults with these programs to think more explicitly about their role, not just in being a mentor or helper to that young person, but as a way of helping that young person, they can connect them with other adults more intentionally, right? Help build those relationships, see themselves as a connector as opposed to, I'm the adult, this is the relationship, I'm kind of the, end all be all. And I think in order to do that, we really as programs want to think more about how can we help the adults who are working with youth, especially if they're coming from outside of the community, how can we help them to be better integrated into youth social networks and communities? And that is going to require the adults to be more skilled in working across difference, especially if they're coming from a different background, personal set of experiences. And we really want to train adults to focus on strengths, focus on pre-existing strengths in the youth, and see adults and their networks as a strength that we want to kind of leverage to help promote more sustainable long-term outcomes. All right, so just want to thank my lab, obviously all of the people who were generous enough with their time to participate in some of this research, the William T. Grant Foundation, who is funding some of the work that we're doing now, and I want to thank you all for your attention and look forward to any feedback and questions you have. Thank you.